lacrimal apparatus and third, fourth and sixth cranial nerves. Before that, we also discussed the competency of anatomical basis of Horner syndrome. So this Horner syndrome results from interruption of the sympathetic nerve supply to the eye. And Horner syndrome is characterized by meiosis, that is constricted pupil, partial ptosis, that is drooping of eyelid, and loss of hemifacial sweating, also called as anhidrosis. Coming to sympathetic innervation, the lateral horn of spinal cord at the level of C8 and T2 represents the first order neuron. The second order preganglion fibers exit the spinal cord at the level of T1 and enter cervical sympathetic chain. So in this picture you can see that the first order neuron is represented by lateral horn. Then the fibers preganglion fibers take origin from the lateral horn. Then they enter the sympathetic chain at the second order, and they will be relaying in the superior cervical ganglion, and the postganglion fibers, they emerge from the superior cervical ganglion. So after emerging as the third order postganglion fibers, they divide. So those which are supplying to blood vessels and the sweat glands, that is called pseudomotor, they go along the external carotid artery, and the pupilomotor will be going through the internal carotid artery to supply the iris dilators. So the fibers ascend through sympathetic chain, synapse in the superior cervical ganglion. Then the postganglion fibers, third order, exit superior cervical ganglion and ascend along the internal carotid artery. Whereas the vasomotor or pseudomotor fibers that branch off travel along the external carotid artery to innervate blood vessels and sweat glands of the face. So the third order pupilomotor fibers ascending along the internal carotid artery enter the cavernous sinus. The fibers then leave the carotid plexus briefly to join the abducens nerve in the cavernous sinus and enter the orbit through the superior orbital fissure along the long ciliary nerves. Then the long ciliary nerves innervate the iris dilator and the Muller muscle, which is responsible for ptosis. Horner syndrome may develop from lesions at any point along the sympathetic way. With the central first order neuron lesions, the anhidrosis affects the ipsilateral side of the body. Lesions affecting second order neurons may cause anhidrosis of the ipsilateral face. With postganglionic lesions occurring after vasomotor and pseudomotor fibers have branched off the sympathetic chain, anhidrosis is either present or limited to an area above the ipsilateral brow. Then we go to enumerate lacrimal apparatus. In the picture you can see, and that is in the anterolateral aspect of the orbit, there is the location of lacrimal gland. You can see that it has got two parts, the big part or the orbital part, then the palpebral part which is in the eyelid, upper eyelid, and both are separated by levator palpebral superioris. You can see the ducts coming from the palpebral part enter into superior conjunctiva of the eye. Then coming to the medial side, we see that from the medial aspect of the eye, the two canaliculi are arising and they will be ending in the lacrimal sac. Lacrimal sac is blind above, that is also called fundus, and below the lacrimal sac continues as nasolacrimal duct, and this nasolacrimal duct opens into inferior meatus. So coming to the components of the lacrimal apparatus, they are the lacrimal gland, then the ducts, then the canaliculi, then the lacrimal sac, and the nasolacrimal duct. So these are the components of the lacrimal apparatus. So for better understanding the lacrimal system, embryology is necessary to understand the lacrimal drainage system. Lacrimal gland begins initially as a solid epithelial buds from the ectoderm of the conjunctal fornix. Then mesenchymal condensation around these buds occurs and forms the lacrimal gland. The epithelial buds form the orbital part. The secondary buds which appear later develop the palpebral part. There is canalization of the epithelial buds forming ducts, and the developing tendon of levator palpebral superioris muscle divides the gland into two lobes. And continuing with the development, so we should see that the excretory system begins during the phase development. The phase develops from 5 processes. The upper process is called as frontonasal process. The lateral processes are called as maxillary process, and the lower process are called as mandibular process. In the center there is stomodium. So a depression termed naso-optic fissure develops, and this is bordered by one side on the lateral nasal process and the inferior, and on the other side by the maxillary process. This naso-optic fissure or groove gradually shallows as the structures bordering it grow and coalesce. So before this fissure is obliterated, a solid strand of surface epithelium thickens along the floor of the fissure, extending from orbit to the nose. The thickened cord of epithelium becomes buried and forms a rod, and it is connected to the surface epithelium at only orbital and nasal ends. So this is what we have seen, that is, we can see that there are, just now we have discussed one cord. So that cord forms, upper part forms the lacrimal sac, the lower part forms the nasolacrimal duct, and the sac will develop canaliculi that will open into the medial side of the eye. So the superior end of the rod enlarges to form the lacrimal sac, and it gives off 2 column of cells that grow into eyelid margin to become the canaliculi. Canalization of this nasolacrimal ectodermal rod begins, proceeding first in the lacrimal sac, then canaliculi, and lastly the nasolacrimal duct. The central cells of the rod degenerate, forming a lumen closed at the upper end and also closed at the inferior end. Superior membrane at the puncta is usually completely canalized when eyelids separate, and therefore is normally patent by birth. Whereas inferior membrane frequently persists in the newborns, resulting in congenital nasolacrimal obstruction. Then we go on to another competency, that is anatomical basis of oculomotor, trochlear and abducens nerves, paralysis along with strabismus. Strabismus is a squint which occurs due to paralysis of either of one of these nerves, that is it can be oculomotor, trochlear or abducens. So eye movements are innervated by cranial nerves, 3rd, 4th and 6th. And these nerves will be innervating 6 extraocular muscles. The oculomotor nerve innervates medial rectus, inferior rectus, superior rectus, inferior oblique muscles as well as levator palpebrae superioris. The trochlear nerve innervates the superior oblique and abducens nerve innervates the lateral rectus. Then coming to oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve, that is CN3. The nuclear complex of cranial nerve 3 lies in the midbrain. It consists of multiple subnuclei. Axons arising from these subnuclei travel in the ipsilateral nerve. That point should be noted. Except axons arising from the superior rectus subnucleus. So they are contralateral. They travel through contralateral third nerve and complex to join the third nerve of that side. In addition, there is a single central caudate nucleus that gives fibers that join both cranial nerves of the oculomotor to innervate levator palpebrae muscles bilaterally. And also there is preganglionic cholinergic fibers that innervate the pupillary constrictor, arise from the paired dorsal Edinger Westphal nuclei. Then coming to trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve is situated ventral to cerebral aqueduct. Axons exist the brainstem dorsally. They decussate and innervate contralateral superior oblique muscle. Abducens. Abducens nucleus is in the pons. It is very close to facial nerve nucleus. The 6th nerve travels ventrally and exists at the pontomedullary junction. Coming to relations of these nerves to the cavernous sinus. 3rd and 4th nerves are in the lateral wall of cavernous sinus. Abducens nerve is content of cavernous sinus and is lateral to internal carotid artery. 3rd nerve splits into superior and inferior divisions within cavernous sinus. Then superior division innervates levator palpebrae and superior rectus muscles. The inferior division innervates the remaining 3rd nerve muscles, that is medial rectus, inferior oblique and posterior pupillary constrictor. All 3 oculomotor nerves exist the cavernous sinus via the superior orbital fissure and pass through the apex of the orbit to reach the target muscles. Then coming to anatomical basis. In nuclear lesions, the clinical picture is that of complete ipsilateral third nerve palsy plus contralateral ptosis and SR, that is superior rectus dysfunction. This is what happens in nuclear lesions. If the nuclear lesion is rostral, the pupillary involvement is likely and muscles may be spared. The most common cause of nuclear complex involvement is due to infarction, that is sudden cut off of the blood supply, hemorrhage and metastasis and other causes. Coming to various syndromes related to the oculomotor nerve, there is one Weber syndrome. In this, there is oculomotor nerve palsy and contralateral hemiparesis. The site of lesion is cerebral peduncle. Benedict syndrome. In this, there is third nerve palsy and contralateral tremors. The site of lesion is red nucleus. Then we have Northern-Gels syndrome. In this we have third nerve palsy and ipsilateral ataxia. The site of lesion is superior cerebellar peduncle. And we have one more syndrome, that is clot syndrome. It is a combination of Benedict's and Northern-Gels syndrome.